if our businesses are disrupted or impacted by international things, by the economy, then that has a flow on to many of our listeners. So, all of us are impacted in one way or another. So I guess what I'm always looking for is the hope that they all achieve their best.
We want good tech companies.
We do. We certainly do.
The New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.
Greetings and welcome along to the New Zealand Tech Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Spain, and it's fantastic to have Bill Bennett, tech and telecommunications and business journalist, joining us again. How are you, Bill?
I'm good, Paul.
Maybe you can remind listeners where you fit into this big wide world of media and tech.
Well, I have a website where I write mainly about telecommunications, but also broader technology stories. I've been writing tech stories off and on for 40 years, and along that, most of that time I've been writing business and so on. I tend to be more at the business end of technology than the consumer end. And I also write business stories for the Herald, particularly business features.
Well, we've got a lot to delve into today. Before we start, a big thank you to our show partners, 1NZ, Spark, 2 Degrees, HP, and Gorilla Technology. Look, I guess the big one that we've just learnt about just really before recording is that Sky TV could potentially be losing All Blacks rights, depending on how things play out. Now, for those that have been following this, New Zealand Rugby have been under some pressure. They've lost their main sponsor, and the reporting has suggested that the amount of revenue that would be coming from rugby rights in New Zealand is expected to, if they were to re-sign a deal with Sky, to be significantly less than what they've been on for the last few years. I think $111 million a year in the current agreement, which covers 2021 to 2025. But for this next 2026 to 2030 period, the suggestions that have been reported are that the Sky offer would bring that down to $85 million a year. Now, when Sky doesn't have any competition, they're a little bit in the driver's seat. But the latest, coming through is that DZAN, which is a big streamer and sports company, UK based, but I think they've recently taken in $1 billion investment out of Saudi Arabia. They've got a lot of financial backing, and they're pretty significant. They've been around for a good period of time. They seem pretty stable. That they're entering the fray, and this is one of those things that if it went that way would cause significant disruption for Sky, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but it's not great from a consumer point of view either, because if you're a rugby fan and you want to watch, say, the Super Rugby and the All Blacks games, you're now going to have 2 subscriptions. It's exactly what's happened. The same company, DAZN, has done that with, they have the rights to UEFA matches now for the soccer. And until a couple of years ago, if you had a Sky subscription, you could watch Premier League football and FA Cup football and so on, and the European games and the World Games as well, the FIFA games as well, all on the one subscription. Now you need, I think if you want to watch everything for your British club, you have to have 3 subscriptions now. Given that Sky is more expensive than it was back then anyway, that means that your bill for watching, if you're a soccer fan, your bill would have gone from $400 a year to roughly $400 a year, depending whether you pay annually or monthly, up to around about double that. And rugby fans can probably expect the same to happen if this goes ahead with that. So it's going to be a lot more expensive, and it also kind of undermines the viability of Sky as a business anyway, because Sky is not traveling well as a business. It's not in desperate position, but it's not traveling well. And this is its main product.
And they've been through a pretty rough period with the satellite changeovers, and lots of folks not
they were looking forward to
not
this.
getting a signal, right?
Yeah, although they I think investors have been looking forward to a dividend from Spark Sport not being in the frame anymore. And, basically it's the same thing all over again. So it's, from Sky's point of view, it's not great. It's not good news, but it's not great news from the consumer point of view. It's great news from New Zealand Rugby because they'll get more money. But it's a bit of a concern.
Mm-hmm. Look, I guess we look back a few years. It was Spark Sport that was hurting Sky. They had the Rugby World Cup
and the cricket,
2019, the cricket.
Yeah,
of course, that was that was a pretty big step for Spark to do that, and in the end, they decided to to exit that. Now, you could argue a whole lot to do with timing and so on. I guess my general feeling was, if I recall correctly, that sometimes it's good for things to be stirred up a little bit, for a bit of competition here. We're now in a different period, and of course this would still be about a year away. We look at a year from now. The percentage of people that would be struggling with broadband access in their homes and so on compared to 2019, night and day difference.
Yeah,
right?
it definitely. But that's the other thing, is that the Spark Sport, when it came along and they got the rights to the Rugby World Cup, that accelerated the fibre build was already been completed at that point. But what Chorus did is they beefed up the network so it could handle much larger amounts of data. And I think there was some work done to beef up the fixed wireless broadband as well.
And Spark and the other the other internet service providers worked really, really hard to make sure that that they had a capability. Now we can all recall there were some challenges.
Yeah, but here's the killer, right? They got all that fixed in time. I mean, pretty much. I mean, the day one wasn't great, but after that, it went pretty well.
Yeah.
And you know what? That was like October, November that year.
Then what
happened in February the following year? We had a lockdown. And New Zealand was one of the few countries in the world which was actually ready for that. That everything was ready in terms of the technology. So these things have a surprise. It's just the same as the thing about the space shuttle gave birth to non-stick frying pans. It's the same thing, that sometimes when something happens in one area like this, something happens elsewhere, and it.
Now, I don't know the numbers, and I don't know if I can easily find them, but I'm curious. Are we entering this next 5-year period for Sky? Is this when they kill off satellite service, or has the cost of it come down so much, and the cost of maintaining it and so on, that actually you just keep that running for a longer period? Because when everyone's got good broadband and so on, that's part of what sort of reduces the barriers to entry. But there's also a point in time where Sky has to just be an internet delivered service. You would imagine. You would imagine,
but here's the thing, right? Fibre goes to 87% of the country. There's some fixed wireless broadband in the remaining part of the country. But rugby's heartland is the rural New Zealand, and that's the area where the connectivity is weakest. So there is an issue there. I mean, to be fair, the West do a wonderful job, and there are some good options now. And of course, there's Starlink, but it's still I think for the moment we still need to have the Sky satellite, at least for the next few years. It's going to be necessary.
Yeah, I'm really, really curious around that. But
I think it's one to watch, and I think something can come along and disrupt that at any moment.
A time when, I would imagine it's sort of this, the second half of the decade where a decision gets made on that, and maybe it's later on in the decade, but we're seeing our mobile speeds get better and better. The mobile networks for fixed wireless, the plans. I noticed the plans that for myself and my team, Gorilla, where everyone got bumped to, I think it's 150 gigs worth of data on your mobile. Now, of course, there's more expensive plans that are full unlimited, and that's kind of the cap for high speed, and then the speed drops off a little bit. So and you've mentioned, of course, Starlink, and there'll be whatever the competitors.
And you're quite right. You're quite right
that
the not the fixed wireless broadband, but mobile networks, the mobile data networks, they at some point they start to kick in and compete with people's broadband. So you're quite right that it's getting better.
Yeah.
But I still think that we're going to... New Zealand's quite conservative about switching things off. I mean, when the Australians built their fibre network, fibre came down the street and copper went out that day. They switched it off. Here...
There just weren't that many that actually got actual fibre to
the
door.
But they were brutal about it. Whereas here, here it took 10 years after the fibre build for them to start pulling out copper lines. We tend to do that in New Zealand. We tend to be a little bit more conservative, and we're a little bit more concerned about the people that are following and struggling perhaps a bit. So
yeah. All right. Well, this is going to be a really, really interesting one. It's going to impact a lot of families if there's a change. But I think probably easier for us to deal with in sort of 2026 era than 2019. Now, lots of other things going on. We've seen that MP's phones, DeepSeek, WeChat, RedNote, CapCut, these are being banned from their devices or from their phones. Now, of course, I'm not sure exactly how this plays out. The level of detail I've seen on it is pretty light.
Can I just jump in here? Right? How many MPs will have DeepSeek on their phone? They're not going to be many. I mean, these are pretty obscure apps. I mean, we've heard of them, but they're quite obscure. And my experience of MPs is they are not the most advanced tech users in our society. So we're talking of a handful of people that are going to be affected here. It's not a big deal. And the other thing is that, in a sense, this is the second part of what happened a few years ago when Huawei phones suddenly went out of fashion because they happen to be a Chinese company. These are largely Chinese apps. I think it's
probably a little bit more than just that they were a Chinese company, Bill.
Yeah, but I know, but other Chinese. I mean, you can still buy other Chinese phones here, and there's no debate about the fact that say, for example, Oppo, which is the other Chinese brand, is just as close to the Chinese Communist Party at home as Huawei was. So it's. Some of this is performative, I think. Some of this is it's sending a message rather than anything. I mean, I'm not saying that these things should be on people's phones, but I'm saying that this is more about a message than the actual denying. I mean, really, do you think some of these MPs out there are using DeepSeek to get advice? I don't know.
Well, DeepSeek got a lot of attention, and of course, it's not that they just appeared, but they suddenly got a lot of attention because of how capable their AI was in the last few days. It's
Paul,
been
we know what Shane Jones does with his downtime.
Phil, I don't want to think about that.
Entertainment. Can you imagine Winston Peters? Look, I think there will be some, but there will be a tiny minority of them.
Yeah. No, look, it's I think important that at a government level these things are thought about and considered. How does this play out for politicians who are? CapCut. That's that's used for editing videos and putting it online, isn't it? So this is the sort of stuff for making your TikTok videos. So what does that do? Does that hurt the Prime Minister? Does this mean he's got to find a new tool. I have no idea what he
I
uses,
would
but
imagine he have a staff to do that for him anyway.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how this sort of plays out on some of the other broader devices. Anyway, on to other topics. Got news through that Robotics Plus have signed a deal to be acquired by Yamaha Agriculture, which is a US-based entity that'll sit under Yamaha Motors. And yeah, this one is interesting. I'm not sure if we've ever reached out to them, but I think I've considered in the past, that'd be a really interesting company to chat with because of their work in robotics, particularly when it comes to the agriculture sector, which is where they've tended to focus. So yeah, we might be able to get a chat lined up there for the future and hear a little bit more about this. But they've got a team of about 130 people, I think, if I recall correctly, largely based in the Bay of Plenty. So yeah, another I guess presumably a pretty successful exit for Robotics Plus, but yeah, maybe not your traditional sort of startup. I know they've been around quite a long time.
Yeah, I think the thing when these stories happen like this, the big question, of course, is how much capacity do they retain in New Zealand over the long haul? I mean, quite often these deals go through and nothing happens for a while. And then one day you wake up and there's been a bit of restructure back at HQ in wherever, in California or wherever, and suddenly the New Zealand branch closes down and perhaps a couple of people get a job in California and that's the end of it. That's the fear with these things.
And that certainly does happen. But I think there's a good capability here, value for money to a degree compared to doing research and development and other roles out of the US. So yeah, I'd be pretty upbeat on this one. I would think they're yes they've been doing international business for sure, but from what I can tell, they've largely been operating from Tauranga, Bay of Plenty area. So
the flip side of that positivity is that often when this kind of thing happens, the money is recycled into new and even more exciting ventures. And quite often they can come back. I mean, in effect, that's exactly what happened with Rod Drury and Zero. He came back from flipping a couple of earlier businesses and had the necessary to start what became $1 billion organization. So I think that's the positive side of this, and I think there's plenty in there. The Bay of Plenty, by the way, is actually really good on this kind of thing. I went to a site visit to a number of Bay of Plenty technology companies, probably about 10 years ago now. But I was actually amazed at just how much there was going on around that area.
Oh, there's some amazing innovation. I was in Tauranga last week in relation to some cybersecurity work that our team are doing with a really impressive company down there, and there's just a lot going on, and you don't always realise it until you get in and have a look.
Yeah, and I think the Bay of Plenty politics pretty good as well. I think so. So I think there's a lot going on. It'll be good to see some money going into the tech sector in that city.
Now, from a New Zealand front, little bit of an AI shortcoming here, really, in this one. So Google have been caught out with their AI breaching New Zealand court name suppression orders. Now, I'm not sure how much testing has been done on other AI systems, but I would imagine if Google haven't got this right, probably not everybody else has got this completely right either. And, of course, the way that they get a name is they found it somewhere online, and then the AI isn't kind of following the legal rulings for New Zealand that bans them from disclosing names. And so this was one I was discussing last week on the news, and it's quite I guess just a reminder that as new technology comes along, it often takes a while for, all the dots to join up and things to align properly. So this has probably been going on, since as soon as AIs have had especially access to the latest data.
What's the difference? I mean, in this case, I think it was, as you say, it was a data leak. It was, in effect, the AI found that piece of information. But if it wasn't finding that information, if it was putting two and two together, if you was to say to your AI, a prominent political figure in New Zealand has been accused of doing X, Y, Z. Who's the list of candidates?
Yeah.
Right. And
it could help you deduce it.
Yeah, and that's a perfectly legitimate use of AI.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And it wouldn't be I don't think that would be breaking the law to do that either. So, I mean, it would be breaking the law if it gave you an answer and then you went out and publicized it.
If it gave one, one
but
certain,
if it told
result.
If it told Paul Spain, well, it happens to be, this person, I think that's probably kind of legitimate. And it's certainly an area for lawyers to debate. But our name suppression laws are pretty weird in by international standards, and they're much stricter than in most other countries.
They did get an overhaul a few years ago, and so my understanding is that they're not used to the same extent that they previously were. However, we see it all the time, don't we, in these scenarios?
Basically, you get it if you're rich enough to afford lots of lawyers. Yes.
Oh, dear. Dear. Yeah. That doesn't fit with New Zealand society.
No, it doesn't, and it seems a bit out of sync, actually.
I guess that the challenge is for people that, I mean, it's not just well-known people, but the challenge is when names aren't suppressed and people jump to all sorts of conclusions before the trial. But that's I don't know how you get that right. And obviously New Zealand's taken a different approach to other countries, and some countries don't have any name suppression. So
no, and in some ways some countries it works a bit differently anyway. But look, I think that it's something that legislators and lawyers are going to have to look at and work on.
Now, the next item on the list, it's a little bit of a follow-on from a story we talked about a few weeks ago with Darcy Ungaro from the NZ Everyday Investor podcast. And that was a case where one of the founders of, I think it was Ledger, who make digital wallets for cryptocurrencies, he'd been kidnapped, and the French police put dozens of people on the case, and they were able to rescue him, but not before he lost a finger. In this case, we've got Bernadette Raoui, who was sentenced to 6 years and 2 months in prison for her role in a 24-day kidnapping and torture, Kayla Pawa. And I mean, this one, just reading through it, it was really shocking. And I think you don't have to read too many of these things if you're invested in crypto for you to, really think seriously about, do you want to be invested in crypto when these are the consequences. And I guess I never had a lot of crypto, but there's a few sort of stories like this, and even just the consideration that it could happen, that said to me, no, I don't want to have, I don't want to be sitting on that sort of thing and create that risk of some sort of iron bar attack. And this kidnapping story, which has been covered across the New Zealand media, probably not given massive prominence, fortunately, but I think it's got to be a cause for concern within that sector. And it highlights the challenges of being your own banks. Banks have a lot of security, and a lot of money goes into security, and nobody wants to have to pay for private security to stay safe unless you're very, very rich. So I think this is going to really cause a stir.
I've upset lots of people in the past talking about crypto, and I say that, and I say this. I've said this on the podcast previously, that crime is the killer app for crypto. It's same as producing a newsletter was the killer app for PageMaker when it first came along, and so on. And it's whether you like it or not, it's just tied up with the criminal world. And whilst I would never say that people that are involved in crypto are necessarily criminals, I would say that an awful lot of criminals are involved in crypto. And that means, and so what it means, it's the risks you take are the same as the risks of going down, to certain parts of town late at night. It's on a par with that. And it kind of, I mean, horrible as this is, and as evil as it is, and it's wrong and everything, it comes with the territory. It's the Willie Sutton was a famous bank robber back in the cowboy days in America, and a newspaper reporter said to him, "Willie, why do you keep robbing banks?" And he said, "That's because the way the money is." and why? So criminals, why are you still doing all this stuff with crypto? Because that's where the money is. It's that simple.
Yeah, it should give people some pause to consider, or if you are, be serious around crypto, you'd want to either find some way that ensures it's clear that you don't have control over it. If you've got some sort of a custody system that it requires sort of multiple people sign off, or you want to keep it pretty quiet. So, but I'm not sure that that's ever something that you could guarantee either. So it has really made me think in the last probably in the last sort of 6 months around these things, and then seeing these two quite recent cases that are really serious. Yeah, I'm glad that's not something I've got to think about, the safety of myself and my family. And look, I hope this sort of thing doesn't happen again. I'm pleased in that they've given a reasonably chunky sentence here.
I mean, it would be
but
the same
I
if you
don't think it's going to put. I don't think it's going to put everyone off.
And I was going to say, it would be the same if you were dealing with like really large amounts of banknotes.
Yeah,
it'd be the same.
Keeping gold in your basement at home and so on, right? Yeah, same sort of risks, right? Yeah, someone's at some point might turn up and demand you hand it over.
Yeah. Just keep it in the bank.
And I guess that's where these crypto type funds and so on, you can get through the likes of Sharesies and so on, come into the picture, because it means you can invest in those, but without having to hold it. Now, there's a flip side to that though, in that you're no longer the bank, but then you are hoping that the entity that you've bought this, say, invested in a crypto fund, that they're going to be able to hold onto your crypto. And of course, we had another one in the news over the last week or so, and I think it was north of a $1.5 billion hack Bybit. So this is sort of USD, and I think I saw some headlines saying this might well be the largest crypto heist ever. It depends sort of the lens that you look at it through. But yeah, we're
Paul,
we're in a difficult place if you are in that crypto world.
Paul, if you go through, if you really want to invest in crypto and go through one of those Sharesies funds, then you're not going to be worrying about suing a council so you can dig up the landfill to look for an old hard drive, which that story.
No, but the fund that you buy into may lose all their crypto if they get hacked, right? So it's like it's none of these. None of the options, and maybe I'm in a pessimistic view about
the smart thing
this
would be
year.
To spread it around a number of the funds, because they're not all going to be hacked.
Yeah, or better yet, invest it into the tech sector, the New Zealand tech sector, and then it's actually working, helping our economy, and so on. So anyway, and we probably need to have a chat to Janine or one of the crew from Easy Crypto again, because I'm sure they've got some more perspectives that I haven't considered in this short chat. But it is an area that's really given me a lot more pause than it has done in the past. Now, just thinking in terms of other things going on, Microsoft have signed a deal with Spark in New Zealand to accelerate Spark's AI services, which is interesting to see. We've had Spark and Chorus announce their financial results. Anything that you wanted to touch on there? We were talking before the show, and you were sort of, I guess, sharing your thoughts on what's going on and how much of Spark's challenges from a financial perspective are a mirror to what's going on overall in the New Zealand economy.
Yeah, both Spark and Chorus are very closely tied to the performance of the economy in general. I mean, the economy does well, they do well. Economy does poorly, they do poorly. But there's definitely certainly in the case of Spark, there's a kind of multiplier effect on that. It goes down much faster because Spark had quite a large number of government accounts. So when the government starts making cuts, that digs in quite sharply. And the other telcos, but 2 Degrees and Vodafone, they don't announce results in the same way, although in One New Zealand, results do turn up in the Infratil result.
Sure.
They actually do. They've been doing reasonably well, but their exposure is to almost to a different sort of customer base.
But they've all been impacted in various ways, and they've had to do layoffs and one has probably been more aggressive doing that than Spark has, but I think Spark will catch up. In fact, that's pretty clear that Spark will catch up with that. But in general, that sector is tied to the economy. What's interesting is that Chorus's result has been seen by the market as being quite negative. The share price has dropped something like 10%. The Spark price dropped at one point, I think it was 30%. So both have been perceived as negative by investors. But the thing about the Chorus result is that Chorus's result is actually quite flat. I mean, I think there was a loss of 5 million, but it's a half-year loss of 5 million. But that's on a revenue of 500 million. So 500 million. So as a percentage, it's tiny, and in effect, Chorus's result is flat. Chorus is down because people have been trading down a little bit. So some people that have had gigabit plans and so on have gone for the slower form of broadband, and there's been less of the new builds, which would help Chorus's result. Spark's result is, again, there's been trading down as people running out of cash, thinking, well, what can we cut this month? Let's have a little bit less broadband, a little bit less data or mobile data or whatever. Multiply that across tens of thousands of people, and you've got a problem. So yeah, basically it's very much a reflection of where the economy is. And I think the thing is that sitting here in Auckland and in our particular sector, we're not perhaps seeing the worst of it that some people in other places are. I mean, in other parts of New Zealand, things are probably a lot tougher than they are here. Yeah, look, I think if you sort of look more broadly as well, sort of looking internationally, so Chorus's price under 4% down on what it was a month ago. Spark 21%, but looking out internationally, Tesla are down nearly the same, just under 19 or around 19%. I think Rocket Lab have seen their shares dropping as well. So yeah, there are challenges kind of all around the world. I see a significant drop for Rocket Lab, but it'll be a whole different story in another 12 months or so. But one of the concerning bits of feedback, and Jolie Hodson, the chief executive at Spark, did an interview with Chris Keel. It's up on the Herald, and she was saying they're not really seeing the signs of any immediate kind of changes in the shorter term anyway. So we've got a bit of a hard period still ahead, and so yeah, it's understandable. Some of these drops.
The other thing about Spark and Chorus is, remember, it's not that long ago they were one company. I mean, it's about 15 years, I think, since they were first going to demerge. But I think they actually, the demerger took place think 12, 13 years ago now. And at that time, Sparks saw that as a sort of liberating thing. It was still called Telecom at that time. It saw it as liberating, and it meant that they could they could chase what was seen as high margin things like digital value add and so on, and which is where they invested in things like Spark Sport and so on. And none of that, well, not none, very few of those what looked like great opportunities at the time of demerger, very few of them paid off. The IoT investment paid off and has paid off really well, but that's actually a relatively small part of their business. Their investment in data centers appears to be paying off, but it requires so much investment and it's not high margin. So it turns out, I think that the two companies had their paths since that time. Chorus has become, in effect, a utility. It's very heavily regulated. I mean, the Commerce Commission decides how much they can spend each year. It has to approve their operational expenditure. So I think what you're seeing is Spark's ride is going to be quite bumpy, whereas Chorus's ride is going to be quite smooth in comparison. And Spark's probably the bumpiest of all the big telcos in this country for that same reason.
Well, I'm hopeful that things bounce back sort of sooner rather than later. Just looked at Rocket Lab; they're down around 26% over the last month, but of course they've gone through some meteoric rises, and they're still up nearly 400% over the past year. If you look back sort of 12 months, so. Yeah, there's an interesting story in that one, and for all those investors, I'm hopeful they'll head back in the other direction, and I'm picking they will with what's going on Neutron wise, but all of these scenarios, I guess, impacted so heavily by the outside factors of the economy, of what's going on politically, and then there's the factors and the moves that they've made within their businesses, and in some ways you could say that Spark has worked really, really hard over the past 10 to 15 years to innovate and to try new things. Probably more than anyone else in that space from varying perspectives, because they've really pushed the boat out in terms of
they've taken some real risks
in terms of that risk taking, which I think is important to do. But unfortunately that those things haven't landed, as is kind of normal with new innovations, as it is for startups and so on, right? So whether it's a big firm doing those things,
it's been a bumpy ride for Spark. I mean, whereas Chorus's ride is quite smooth. There's an upside as well. I mean, Spark, if Spark has an upside, the upside can be really good as well. So it's still there. It's still potentially there. But I do think that one of the things that happened in that period after the demerger was that Spark decided to focus very much on New Zealand, and it had investments in Australia and internationally and so on, which it just got rid of them. Telecom Cook Islands was owned by Telecom New Zealand at one time. It got rid of everything outside of New Zealand to focus on the home market. The problem is you then become, much more vulnerable to the conditions in the home market.
Although, those things, clearly were distractions.
Oh,
right? And probably in the light of day, I wouldn't be surprised if you looked at how could that have played out if they'd kept them versus getting rid of them. That they could well have ended up on the better side.
The only thing that I've got just in the back of my mind, and I've been writing about telecoms for a long time, is I'm still not 100% convinced that the way that the towers are sold off and when the towers are sold off is the best way to do that. It's something that telcos have done across the world.
Yes.
It's, supermarkets don't own the buildings, and, most big retailers don't own their buildings. It's because it's tying up capital that can be used elsewhere. So it's not an unusual thing. But I just think that might not have been done. I mean, right now, Spark's result might be looking a bit brighter. I haven't sort of gone back and looked across the figures, but I've just got this slightly uneasy feeling that I just think that New Zealand telcos are just a bit too quick into that, but that's a gut feeling. It's not a piece of analysis. It's just that sort of somewhere in the back of your head, it's telling you that could have been done better.
Interesting. I actually thought they did very well on that front, and in part because people keep raising with me, are we going to be in a position in the not too distant future where cell towers are no longer required because satellite internet will be so good? Now, when I think about that, I think, well, hold on, I was on the phone from driving into the car park, which is surrounded with concrete, when I jumped in the elevator, and I had, largely, pretty good connectivity, up to here on level 13. And so, there's a scenario there where I see, well, I'm not sure satellite's going to be able to do that. So there's an element where I'm not sure if there's any credibility to this idea of, completely getting rid of cell sites at some, distant point in the future at all. But I do see people keep sort of asking that question, and if there's any likelihood of it, then the quicker that telcos sold those things off, the better. But I can't
on that front. That's on that front. It probably, if they'd left it longer, they might have not got the same price. Yeah, you're quite right. But look, there's all kinds of problems with switching from a terrestrial network to a satellite one, not least of which the sheer number of satellites that would be required to provide the level of bandwidth. Satellite backhaul is not as efficient as fiber backhaul that comes from the cables. When you have vast numbers of satellites in orbit, as opposed to, I mean, off the top of my head, there's probably between 8,000 and 10,000 in right now. I think the last time I looked, there was 6,700 Starlink, but that was 2 weeks ago, and there might be more today. Once you start getting those kinds of numbers of satellite in orbits, other things happen, right? The first one is they have to maneuver out of each other's way a bit more than they otherwise would. There's a problem emerging with satellites re-entering the atmosphere, burning up and destroying the ozone layer. That's only just become noticeable because when one or two satellites are re-entering orbit every year, that wasn't really being picked up. Now it's hundreds are coming down every year.
Is it though? Because
the
thing I read,
got 6,000 satellites.
Yeah, but the bits I read on it said it may be an issue. No, I haven't read anything to say. Well, actually, the measurement is that actually the ozone layer is now, going the other way. Look, I think there were some predicted dates of when
ozone
it's
layer
resolved.
or not ozone layer, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of chemicals that are now in the atmosphere at that level that weren't there before, right?
That's certainly not my area of expertise.
No, but that's it. We don't know, do we? I mean, would we have? I mean, we probably would have gone ahead and burnt coal if we knew that it was going to be global warming, in the Industrial Revolution. But we don't know. We can't see that. But that could become an issue. That could yet become an issue. The fact that sovereignty is an issue. If you happen to, I mean, there's already been talk in the last week of the US using Starlink to put pressure on Ukraine over politics and negotiations and so on. Do we want to be in a position where, we have to cut the price that we get for our milk, or we lose our Starlink satellites? I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I'm saying it becomes a possibility that isn't a possibility when we own our own networks. Right. So there's all kinds. So what I'm saying is there's a whole raft of issues that go beyond the technology of whether satellites can do this or not. Yeah. And I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm saying that it brings around problems that haven't even been thought about yet. And one of the other things I think which we haven't really addressed in this space is that At the moment, you have Starlink. There's going to be Amazon's network. There's going to be OneWeb's network. There's going to be a Chinese network. There's going to be a Russian network. There's going to be probably a couple of other international networks. And there won't be a New Zealand network. There won't be a New Zealand satellite constellation. So we have to give up that degree of sovereignty over it. I think the first candidate for doing that could be Apple and its Global Star investment. I suspect that's probably in the back of Apple's mind, that they could sell you a phone and a connection using Global Star if it becomes a constellation on that scale. They already do it with their emergency satellite phoning in emergencies and so on. But I think there are more questions than the ones I've mentioned as well that come when we start doing this.
There's a lot of complexity, around spectrum, reaching areas that a satellite sort of can't reach and so on. I drive through the tunnel here in Auckland, and others drive around through different tunnels in different parts of the country. And in a lot of cases, we're able to get sort of coverage in these things. So, lots of bits and pieces, and not to mention the bandwidth that you've highlighted. But I think this will become a topic that will be coming up again over the years ahead as the technology develops. Of course, we're in a position at the moment where it's a very, very, very tiny percentage of the world's population has access to a satellite phone. But of course, as these new offerings sort of come into the market and develop, and different companies start building out their satellite networks, then that will change. And actually, I saw AST Space Mobile also in the news over the last week. They were testing with AT&T and one of the other US mobile networks, Verizon, and they were testing out video calls.
I think AST is the one that's got the really big satellites, aren't they?
Yeah. So at the moment they've got, I think, 5 satellites covering the US, and they're gigantic.
I think they're size of tennis courts.
From what I can see. Yeah. And look, that's a really interesting company to watch, and there's the potential that they become a major player, but do it in a very, very different way to what we're seeing from Starlink, where they don't have to have anywhere near the same number of satellites, but they can still deliver a capable result. But these are all things where there's a fair bit of maths and science to kind of figure them out, and I don't know how it plays out.
And economics, right? Because one of the fears with Starlink, and there's been places in the world where this has already happened, is how Uber came in, right, and it was 30% cheaper than catching a cab, and everyone thought Uber's wonderful. Now suddenly Uber is actually as expensive as catching a cab, and if you're unlucky and you want to get home from Eden Park after a test match or something, it's like a lot more expensive than getting a cab, right? Because they've wiped out enough opposition to be able to hike their prices. Well, Starlink you could argue that Starlink is in that same sort of subsidy phase, heavily subsidized phase. And there are parts of the world now where Starlink's hiked its prices because it has a virtual monopoly. That could take on big time. So those... It's going to be interesting to see whether the economics of terrestrial mobile can compete with the economics of satellite mobile. And the problem with satellite networks is that no one in the world has more money than the owner of the Starlink network. And if you've got like $1 trillion that you can invest to wait while the competition dies, then you might want to do that, and build a monopoly that way. So I'm not saying this is, I'm saying this is purely hypothetical, but I'm just saying we need to think about all those angles.
Yeah, and really, really important as a country to be, taking a big picture view, putting our futurist hats on and thinking through it for those who, are able to influence and contribute to how these things play out into the future. Now, there's probably a few more things we could delve into, Bill, but our time is running out. So encryption is something we've talked about, over the years. I see news there. Amnesty International have sort of leaned in on what's going on in the UK, and we saw that pressure coming from UK government on Apple to provide access to what is currently encrypted user data in terms of backups of people's devices, which could then provide access to messages and all these other all their other encrypted data. And Apple, from what I was reading, was refusing and saying no. But really, the government put so much pressure on that they're no longer offering their encrypted backup service.
Yeah.
And so, interestingly, by default, Apple backups are not encrypted. So you do have to go in and actually turn on that in your advanced settings to have them encrypted. But I think as sort of, I guess, technology users these days, our expectations have largely moved to, hey, my data will be encrypted in one way or another. But this leaves really a loophole open for the government. And I guess, looking back at some of the sort of past discussions on this topic, whichever way you go, there are shortcomings, right?
Yeah.
If you go the way the UK government are going, then it gives some room for law enforcement to be able to get access to data and to solve crimes. But the general tendency over quite a period of years now has been, look, if people's data is encrypted, then governments and police forces, as a general rule, shouldn't have automatic access to that.
Yeah, look, one of the groups of people that uses this the most are journalists. Now, I don't need to, because I write about business and technology, and frankly, no one's going to be looking at my encrypted notes. But if I had been talking,
unless you got a tip off from somebody tomorrow, Bill, that needed to keep secret.
Well, it happens,
It could happen.
but it does happen. I mean, I have over the years, I have had some stories like that. But I still think that it's more likely to be used if you're dealing with things like talking to people that are in hiding or whistleblowers and so on.
Yep.
And it could happen.
Or maybe those that are anti-government, right? And we've seen varying states where the government aren't necessarily too friendly and necessarily too trustworthy.
Yeah. That too. Look, it's a very fraught subject. I mean, we're coming to the end of the podcast. I don't think we need to go on for another hour discussing this. But my thinking,
just 2, Bill, just 2 hours.
But my thinking on this is that governments actually, they can back off. They should be backing off. I don't think this reflects well on a government. It starts to look a bit totalitarian. It does. And it starts to look a bit like, what's going on in your bedroom or what's going on in your house. And it's definitely a big brother aspect to it. And the argument that if you've got nothing to hide, that's nonsense. It's a nonsense argument. There are all sorts of things you might not want people to know. If you happen to be, I was talking to someone else very recently about the whole, believe it or not, the whole Ashley Madison story, and how there were stories about people who were outed in certain countries who died as a result of having their affairs become public. And it's that serious. That's what can happen. It's not happening at the moment with any Western governments, but I think there are probably other governments where there could be things that would be life-threatening.
Well, we have a massive, if you look around the world, a massive grid of surveillance, and certainly around New Zealand and most of our towns and cities in terms of cameras. You look at London as the UK is at the extreme end of that, and then the more sort of totalitarian regimes tend to lean even more in that sort of direction. So there are some things here beyond just the encryption story that are in differing ways connected, and especially when we look at just how poor governments and organizations often are with how they store and secure and keep data private. So there's some areas here I think that need continued consideration. We shouldn't just say, well, I've heard these sorts of stories for so many years, I'm not going to read them anymore.
No, but look, here's a story. It's very real and it's very now right. Apparently in the US at the moment, Elon Musk's team are going through encrypted data in government databases. As we speak, that's happening in the US. Now, they're probably looking for people to sack, quite frankly, but they could be looking for something else in there. And it could be stuff which is legitimately encrypted. So I do think we need to defend encryption. I think that's quite important. They can't have everything.
Yeah, well, the US politics, that would be another hour or two we could delve in.
I don't think we need to go any further.
But thank you, Bill. It's been great to have you back on the New Zealand Tech Podcast again, and always fascinating to hear your insights and opinions. So thanks for joining today. For folks who are wanting to sort of tap into some of what you've been writing, they go across to billbennett.co.nz.
Yeah. And you'll find me there. Yeah.
And you've got a newsletter as well there.
Weekly newsletter.
To sign up for.
It's free. It's not. And actually, one of the things I do with my newsletter is I make a point of not collecting any data. So probably about a quarter of the names in there are things like Donald Duck and so on. I'm not interested. I don't want your data. I want you to read it.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you, Bill. And of course, a big thank you to our show partners, Gorilla Technology, HP, 2 Degrees, Spark, and 1NZ. And we appreciate them sort of coming on the NZ Tech Podcast journey with us and supporting us through the years. They're amazing contributors to our tech and innovation ecosystems in New Zealand, and do a great job. But I always like to speak my mind, so that's kind of how we do it. So I
think we're also concerned about their health as well.
Of course we are. Yeah. The health of our, there's that two sides of if our businesses are disrupted or impacted by international things, by the economy, then that has a flow on to many of our listeners. So all of us are impacted in one way or another. So I guess what I'm always looking for is to the hope that they all achieve their best.
We want good tech companies.
We do. We certainly do. Awesome. Well, thank you, Bill. Thanks everybody for listening in. If you're listening to the audio, then make sure you're also following us on a video platform. We stream probably the majority of episodes, not every episode, online. You can get those by following myself on LinkedIn or X, and also NZ Tech Podcast across most of the channels like YouTube and LinkedIn and Facebook and so on as well. So if you follow from both perspectives, you've got a reasonably good chance of keeping up to date with our episodes. And also I'll tend to post, last week I was interviews on TV3 and TVNZ, and I've shared one of those on some of those channels. So that's another way of sort of keeping up to date with my bits and pieces. And definitely get in there and get on Bill Bennett's email list. Good stuff. Cheers.
The New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.